There are many issues that our nation faces each day. Some are natural and unavoidable, like hurricanes and tornadoes, while some are manageable through helpful bills being passed by legislators. The main issue is that many people aren't represented enough for meaningful change. Many can argue that any U.S. citizen over 18 has the right to vote, so everyone's vote counts equally. Well, that isn't exactly the case. Voter suppression is a method utilized by people in power or minority groups not to vote. Sentiments like these can be dated back to the very moment people were even able to vote in the United States. In recent years, voter suppression isn't as obvious as it was back when only white men with property could vote, but it still implicitly impacts our democratic society today. Figuring out what topic to pick was hard because there are simply too many to choose from. Despite that, I knew that voter suppression was an issue that led to biased politicians being elected, which is what leads to many problems not being fixed. Due to this, as a congresswoman, I would combat voter suppression by continuing to educate the public about pushing out bills that protects their right to vote, while simultaneously fighting to get the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed in Congress. Before we get into discussing possible bills, it is very important that we understand the different ways that states and legislators may try to discourage voting. In this upcoming clip, you will hear the multiple forms that voter suppression can take.
Examples of the ways in which officials are working to undermine minority voting rights are outlined in my testimony and include barriers to voter registration, draconian requirements imposed on groups that are working to register people to vote, purge programs, restrictive mandatory photo ID laws, polling place closures, polling places moved to hostile locations like police departments, ineffective language assistance for LEP voters, long lines at polling sites due to staffing or machine issues, mass rejection of absentee ballots, faulty technology that risks votes not properly counted, and systems subject to hacking, cuts on early voting opportunities, vote dilution, and racially gerrymandered maps.
Starting to get the idea? That was Kristen Clark, and she is the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice. In that clip provided by C-SPAN, she makes it easier to understand the different ways people become discouraged when it comes to voting. In the past few years, we've seen an increase on restrictions placed on voting. With this comes the impact that this has on voters. Take Florida for an example, where in 2018, Floridians voted in favor of letting residents with past felony convictions obtain their right to vote. This gave 1.2 million people in Florida their right to vote, but in order to combat that, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis made a law requiring that all past felons had to pay off their court debts. This disenfranchised about 800,000 Floridians who only recently just got their rights back. Thankfully, there is an organization called We Got the Vote hoping to raise money for those Floridians, and if you'd like to contribute, then I'll leave a link towards the end. Now imagine this scenario. You're standing in a long line during May waiting for your turn to vote. This day is oddly hot, so people who understand this decide to provide waiting voters with food and water in order to convince them to stay in line. How would you feel if I told you that distributing food and water to waiting voters is now illegal in Georgia? There are many more examples of oddly specific laws and restrictions aimed at blocking out votes, but the main question is, what can I, as a congresswoman, do about it? Well, it all starts with everyone watching this at home. Your engagement with the government matters, especially your vote. Public opinion can help shape legislation and even encourage representation. The beautiful thing about my job is that I'm able to propose bills that can one day hopefully be turned into laws. The thing is, we need the people of America to engage in order for other representatives and senators to also vote in favor of enacting bills that combat voter suppression. Getting the Freedom to Vote Act would allow for Election Day to become a national holiday so that many more people have access to voting, while also allowing states to have early voting up to 2 weeks prior to Election Day, while also allowing for mail-in ballots to happen, while also requiring states to make voting more accessible for people with disabilities, while lastly requiring that states broaden the types of identification needed so that many people will have access to voting. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, we'd work on reversing the 2013 Supreme Court decision to get rid of a portion of the Voting Rights Act that aimed at reviewing voting laws in order to avoid voter suppression. These laws may not immediately change the centuries of oppression that marginalized groups faced when dealing with enfranchisement, but they will at least work at giving everyone a fair chance when it comes to voting. My last point involves an American attorney that goes by Han von Spakovsky. Here's what he has to say.
Americans overwhelmingly support the common sense requirement that you ought to have to show an ID when you vote, authenticate your identity. We do it every day when we board a plane, often when we buy drugs at pharmacies, and overwhelmingly Americans support that. And that's a majority, by the way.
What he is saying is not entirely true because there are millions of Americans without appropriate forms of identification because it is either too costly or there are too many barriers to acquiring one. You asked me what I, as a congresswoman, would focus on, and I said voter suppression. Now, I implore you to think why the supposed greatest democracy in the world would not encourage voting. Why in Georgia it would take residents from a predominantly black neighborhood an average waiting time of 51 minutes to vote, while in white neighborhoods it was 6. If you can remember anything that I've told you in these past 6 minutes, please remember that our voice is our vote. Thank you, C-SPAN, for providing me with a project that made me think more critically into important issues like voter suppression, and thank you to these websites for aiding me in this project, because without these websites, my project wouldn't be possible. Again, if you'd like to support We Got the Vote, please scan this QR code.